Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization dedicated to peace, economic and social justice, good government, and a clean environment. Every month, we invite an expert to enlighten us on a topic related to our mission. Because Village TV videotapes these presentations, we can share that expertise with a larger audience. We hope you enjoy today's broadcast.
Justin Levitt was born and raised in Bridgewater, New Jersey. He holds 3 degrees from Harvard, after which he clerked for the liberal Los Angeles Appeals Court Judge Stephen Reinhardt. He went on to publish in top law reviews, serve as counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, then joined the faculty at Loyola Law School. Among his forays while on leave from that position, he has served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of Obama's Department of Justice and as Senior Advisor for Biden's White House Domestic Policy Council on Voting. Currently, he is sought after by outlets like CNN, PBS, NBC, Fox, BBC, testifies before Congress and advises government agencies. A 3-time winner of Loyola's Excellence in Teaching Award, Mr. Levitt maintains the website All About Redistricting, which, thanks to the Supreme Court, he is constantly updating. Tonight he will speak to us on the work of democracy. Please welcome Mr. Levitt.
Thank you so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. And thank you all. You are free to snooze whenever you wish. There are no rules here. If you decide that is the better way to spend your time, I will completely understand. I am so tremendously honored to be here for the 2026 Millie Hicks Lecture. I understand this is an extraordinary series made possible by a truly extraordinary benefactor, and clever, too, as I hear. A fun way to meet firemen. And I am profoundly grateful to be here with all of you, so thank you. I have been working on systems of democracy in various roles for more than a quarter century now. So I was telling you a little bit about my experience before the very good question. I've had the opportunity to work at nonprofits in civil rights and civil liberties. I've had the opportunity to work in leadership on national political campaigns. I've had the pleasure of taking an academic role and an academic view of the democratic process as a scholar of constitutional law and administrative law and as an election law professor at Loyola Law School just up the road. And I've had the opportunity to serve in the Department of Justice and occasionally in the White House. Through all of those roles, my main approach to civil rights and democracy has been very consistent. It hasn't changed all that much. The resolution on the photos has changed. My hairline has unfortunately quite a bit changed. Sadly, some of the institutions I've worked for have changed, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. We are having a moment right now in the democracy field. But I want to give you some sense of where this is going before we get there. And because I'm a professor, and because we need to set the table a bit, I want to start with just a tiny bit of backstory. 1787 is where we start our journey. A group of civic-minded visionaries, brimming with ideals and brimming with blind spots, gathered to try and hammer out a new national order that was better than the Articles of Confederation. Elizabeth Willing Powell wasn't in the negotiations at the time. No women were. Indeed, this contemporary portrait was simply titled Mrs. Samuel Powell. She didn't get a name of her own. It would take another 133 years for a national commitment to recognizing women's political equality. We are still working on it. We've still got a long way to go. But even then, Elizabeth was a powerful political force, and even without a formal seat, she hosted gatherings in Philadelphia for the movers and shakers throughout the Constitutional Convention. When Ben Franklin paid her a visit on September 17th, 1787, the story goes she wanted to know where they stood. So she said to Ben Franklin, "Well, doctor, what have we got?" "A republic," replied Franklin. if you can keep it. We inherited that innovation. None of us made that choice, but for hundreds of years, though none of us have made that choice, it's been on us to keep it. And we've been working on keeping it ever since. Not just keeping it, improving it, building the country into a more perfect union. The notion that we could get better, the notion that the whole point was to keep getting better, was baked in from the outset. It's right there in the founding charter, the thing we're going to be celebrating in just a few weeks. A more perfect union. That's the point. Now, had Elizabeth Willing Powell lived across the river from Philadelphia in my home state of New Jersey, she would have been eligible to vote just 3 years after her conversation with Ben Franklin. A more perfect union. And she would have been blocked from voting again 17 years after that. A less perfect union. It took decades and the mobilization of millions of suffragists to ensure the passage of the 19th Amendment, to make progress real and lasting. That was real work at keeping the Republic. In 1965, in the midst of unspeakable violence and unbearable oppression from antagonists in uniform who should have been protectors, a courageous group, identified by those in authority only by the color of their skin, set out from Selma, Alabama. On a bridge named, still to this day, after the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, they were met with clubs and tear gas. And their courage brought us the Voting Rights Act of 1965, an enduring still, despite what you heard a couple weeks ago, an enduring commitment to meaningful racial equity, passed with sweeping bipartisan majorities every time it was renewed and revitalized. I'm going to put an asterisk on that in a second, but that was real work at keeping the Republic. These battles recognize the remarkable power in the sacred right to vote, in the affirmation of the ability to govern ourselves. It is one of the essential ways, I said just a moment ago, that we build the world that we want to live in together. Whether you're interested in jobs or immigration or the environment or healthcare or national security or education or roads or bridges or the water supply or the electrical grid, the infrastructure underneath it all, whether you're interested in any of those things, then you're interested in democracy, in voting rights, in redistricting. The stuff that I do is the infrastructure of infrastructure. It's how we do us. And it's one of the ways that we build who we are. The power of the ballot is a measure of community, of inclusion, of belonging, of mattering. It's not the only way we communicate those things, not at all. But the power of representation is profound and it is undeniable. And if you want to see it up close, really up close, talk to somebody who's been unjustly prevented from casting a valid ballot, disenfranchised and excluded and mad about it. Or better, much better, talk to somebody who's casting their ballot for the first time or their first time back in a long time, a new voter or a new citizen, or someone who's had their rights restored in a way that makes them feel worthwhile. There's a moment of jubilation there. There's raw emotion in that moment. It's part of why I do this work. And it is a feeling to treasure and to fight for. We don't leave our choices of officials up to public opinion polls, because that act is a constitutive act. It helps make us who we are. And that's a gift. Or at least that's the idea. 238 years in, we are still fighting to get it right, to get it more right than we had it before. Our founding documents commit us to being a work in progress, forever and always. And slowly, imperfectly, and even in moments like this today, we are getting it more right. And I think it's really important to remember that. In 2016, the first African-American president visited Selma, Alabama, and embraced the sitting member of Congress who had been beaten with billy clubs there as a student 50 years before. That's getting it more right. Later that year, one of the two major political parties, for the first time, named a woman as the presidential nominee, and Susan B. Anthony's gravestone in New York was covered with "I voted" stickers. 2017, Americans elected 8 openly transgender officials, including the first elected openly transgender woman of color. 2018, with turnout higher for a midterm than in any year since 1914, Americans elected the first openly gay governor, and the first Muslim women, the first Native American women, and the most women ever to Congress. In 2019, there were firsts in cities from Alabama to Wyoming, breaking glass ceiling after glass ceiling after glass ceiling in mayor's offices and city council offices and county commission offices for gender and race and ethnicity and sexual orientation. And in 2020, in the midst of a raging pandemic, hard to remember now, but a month before one single American had their first vaccine shot, a month before vaccines were ever available, more Americans than at any point in history, by number and percentage, cast ballots. And a greater percentage of the eligible electorate cast ballots than at any point since the 19th Amendment doubled the denominator. In 2020, we hit a turnout rate of 66 or 67%. 69% here in California. Now, to a professor, 69% still leaves a lot of what we like to call room for improvement. We weren't at the end of the road. We weren't even at the beginning of the end. But as Winston Churchill might have said, we were barely at the end of the beginning. Still, more voices than at any point in history? That's a good start. I like that start. That, to me, is the right trajectory. And then, January 6th, 2021. A republic, if you can keep it. Progress rarely runs in a straight line. Women got the right to vote in New Jersey, then lost the right to vote in New Jersey 17 years later. And it took 113 years and home state heroine Alice Paul to get it back. The Constitution gave us a democratic republic, but democracy is not inevitable. There are plenty of societies that used to be democracies. It takes work to keep it. Here's my dog. And a little bit of a palate cleanser. Because now we get into the really hard work. A few minutes ago, I called democracy the infrastructure of infrastructure, the substrate on which we build absolutely everything else that we do. Most people, most of the time, only notice infrastructure when something goes wrong. Most of the time, bridges are just there. But a bridge collapses, and you notice. Suddenly. That's true for democracy, too. People only really notice it when something starts to go wrong. Tell you what, people are starting to notice. People are starting to notice that the president is trying to rule by executive order, rather than by law, to a dramatically unprecedented degree. This, by the way, is just the first 100 days, and you might notice an awful lot of activity down there in the last column. But the pace has continued to an extent not seen since the dawn of the administrative state itself. And it's not just the quantity. It's what these executive orders attempt to do. A few portions of these are within the president's authority. Congress has given the American president an enormous amount of discretion in an enormous range of arenas. Even when I worked for a president, I thought an awful lot of that discretion might have been misplaced. But still, it exists. And that means that in some areas, Congress has delegated to the president, and some of what the president is doing is unquestionably within his authority. Far more often, far more pieces are not, often blatantly, obviously not. Purporting to declare facts that aren't facts, and that the president has no legal authority to declare facts. Purporting to cancel funding that the president has no legal authority to cancel. Purporting to fire people the president has no legal authority to fire. Purporting to eliminate agencies the president has no legal authority to eliminate. Purporting to direct enforcement bodies to undertake enforcement actions the president has no legal authority to direct against state and local government and private individuals and enterprises, often in ways that directly violate constitutional and statutory protections. These executive orders that the president is issuing, they purport to remake the administrative state, contrary to laws that Congress has passed. These executive orders purport to remake the private sector, contrary to laws that Congress has passed, and often contrary to the Constitution. They purport to establish the president's whim as a national mandate. But people are starting to notice. People are starting to notice that the president has had some help in this effort from his cabinet and from historically independent positions outside of the cabinet, like the director of the Office of Management and Budget, or the Federal Trade Commission, or the Federal Communication Commission. Now, to be clear, working to further presidential policy priorities is 100% normal. But this degree of fealty is unprecedented. These individuals in the cabinet are Senate confirmed. And in every other administration, every single one, they've had ideas and they've had power bases of their own. The president's in charge, yes, but political scientist Richard Neustadt recognized 60 years ago that the president's primary power is the power to persuade, not to order. Most of the time the persuasion works. Sometimes, in normal times, it doesn't. Cabinet officials stand up to the president from time to time. When the president's impulse is to exceed his authority, cabinet members have hundreds of tools to slow walk compliance when they want. The president can give an order, and 4 years later, it may still not be done. But when the president chooses cabinet officials who have no interest in deploying their authorities as Congress intended, and no interest in governance, when Congress confirms individuals whose loyalty is to the president rather to the agency they serve and the public that they serve, that's when the composition of the cabinet makes an enormous difference. Because the cabinet simply becomes an extension of the president himself. And that is really meaningful power. That's no longer the power to persuade. The president only has the power to ask, but cabinet members have hundreds of tools to exert coercive force, including in ways that are litigation resistant. This is why they have to be confirmed by the Senate, even though they don't have to confirm the president, because of that coercive force. Credible threats of investigations, or withholding of funding, or the termination of contracts, or the refusal to grant regulatory approval, they don't have to actually happen. It's enough that regulated entities believe that they might happen. Neither the FTC nor the FCC had to pass one word of actual regulation to get much of the legacy media to change the nature of their coverage, or the personnel doing the covering. There only had to be a credible threat. Federal officials are using their powers to try and punish and extort institutions that are fulfilling constitutional roles and with constitutional protections, with no divide between the president's impulses and the agencies themselves. People are starting to notice. Without lawful leadership from cabinet secretaries or meaningful oversight from Congress, people are starting to notice other federal officers coloring outside the lines too. Immigration officials, masked and out of uniform, have been detaining citizens, kidnapping non-citizens, tear gassing bystanders, including children, without appropriate training or cause or due process. Use of force in law enforcement operations is permissible in certain circumstances. Wanton and unnecessary use of force in law enforcement operations is a violation of the Constitution. This is Minneapolis in January. This is my home state of New Jersey, 1 week ago, on the outside of a detention center with a hunger strike inside to protest abusive conditions there. That's US Senator Andy Kim in the lower left there, trying to calm everybody down moments before he was pepper sprayed. Acting US Senator. That's not normal. And those are ostensibly civil authorities, not military. We've had real military in the streets too. National Guard, and sometimes active military, in uniform, including in Los Angeles, just up the road, but not operating on lawful authority. People are starting to notice. Now, all of that, and plenty more, is being defended by the Department of Justice. It's got a new picture too. Here, I'll make it a little bit clearer. And as a former DOJ official, I'll be honest, this one hurts personally. I don't recognize any part of this. When I worked for the DOJ, I didn't work for the president. He wasn't my boss. I worked for Attorney General Loretta Lynch. She was appointed by the president, sure, and he led the administration in which she served. But he wasn't her boss either. She worked for the people of the United States. That's who I ultimately reported to. The separation between the White House and the Department of Justice has waxed and waned from administration to administration. You have seen different iterations of this to different degrees, but for 50 years, there's been bipartisan consensus that the White House gets to set DOJ's general policy and general enforcement priorities, and the White House does not get to direct particular enforcement operations or cases. This banner went up, and that barrier came down. Quality of work has gone down at the same time, and that also hurts. The Department of Justice used to be perhaps the most respected litigating entity in the country, uniformly. You've heard people say, don't make a federal case out of that. That's because a federal case, a DOJ case, is a big deal. Not because of the name on the outside of the building, because of the quality of the lawyering on the inside. For decades, DOJ lawyers have been an elite bunch with layers and layers of review and meticulous attention to detail. All of that care often made DOJ cases slow, but exceedingly steady and exceedingly reliable. And it kills me to use the past tense. That's more than 3,300 DOJ lawyers have left since the start of the administration. 3,300. In the Civil Rights Division, where I used to work, 75% of the attorneys are gone. That's not because of an ideological opposition. These are attorneys who went to work and served Republican presidents and Democratic presidents and Republican attorneys general and Democratic attorneys general for decades. And 90% of the work was absolutely consistent from administration to administration, because that's what happens when you put your head down and apply statutes to facts in a nonpartisan way. When you're just enforcing the law, there are small shifts in priorities, but not that much changes day to day. So when I say 75% of the attorneys in the Civil Rights Division are gone, that's not because the priorities are different. It's because the approach is different. The care is different. Recent DOJ attorneys have misrepresented the law. They've lied to courts. They have pursued blatantly political prosecutions, violating their oaths, not only their oaths of office to serve in federal government, but to the bars that license them. They've made, frankly, embarrassing amateur mistakes. And it's because the attorneys who know what they're doing have largely left. Not just DOJ. There was an article in the New York Times on Sunday, this past Sunday, reporting that 10,000 lawyers have left federal government across all of the agencies. DOJ has been hit hardest. That's turned the Department of Justice from a feared litigator to a little bit of a laughingstock, frankly. You've heard that a federal prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. That saying isn't really about how compliant grand juries are. That's about how prepared federal prosecutors are. And to tell you what, these federal prosecutors aren't indicting ham sandwiches anymore. Federal prosecutors aren't prepared, and they are bringing horrible cases, and the public is standing up to it. Grand juries are rejecting indictments all across the country, in DC, in Los Angeles, in New York. And judges are throwing out indictments, including for grand jury misconduct, in Chicago, in Virginia, in Wyoming. In the world of election law, where I do most of my work, the Department of Justice has sued more than 30 states to get copies of the state's voter files. 8 courts have ruled so far. Every single one has ruled against the DOJ. 0 for 8. That is not a great batting average. And when the DOJ sent the letter to Texas that kicked off the mid-decade partisan gerrymandering blitz that we're experiencing right now, here's how a federal judge described it. And I quote, "It's challenging to unpack the DOJ letter from the Civil Rights Division because it contains so many factual, legal, and typographical errors. Indeed, even attorneys employed by the Texas Attorney General, who professes to be a political ally of the Trump administration, describe the DOJ letter as, quote, legally unsound, quote, baseless, quote, erroneous, ham-fisted, and, quote, a mess." And it is. That's a federal judge appointed by President Donald Trump describing the DOJ's work. They're not bringing their finest. The DOJ has lost the confidence of the public and the courts. In just a few months, they've undone about 150 years of goodwill. People are starting to notice. That last part about the courts, by the way, is worth reiterating. The courts overall, trial and appellate courts all over the country, are doing a great job. They are doing a wonderful job. There's been a massive flood of legal challenges to the way the administration is going about its business. This is a chart from just the first 100 days of challenges to the president's executive orders. That says, I think, that there were 328 cases brought in the first 100 days. They're up to 800 lawsuits at the moment against the president's executive orders. And add to that thousands of individual cases on behalf of people abducted by ICE, including citizens and legal residents that have been swept up in the mix. The Department of Justice is in those cases, but judges largely aren't buying what they're selling. They are instead putting their heads down and trying to figure out the right answer without relying on the government as a straight shooter. And the judges are ruling, judges appointed by Republicans and judges appointed by Democrats and judges appointed by this president are ruling based on determinations that apply law and reasoned opinions to facts determined on the ground. I don't agree with every one of those opinions, of course. But across the board, they're trying to make sense of what's going on out there. They're doing law, a lot of law. And most of those challenges are winning. This is a graph of the cases against the executive orders. Gold is a win by the challengers. Purple is a win by the government. Gray is still pending. It's an awful lot of gold in that chart. But court cases are slow, even when judges are trying to work quickly. There may be an awful lot of gold in that chart, but there's an awful lot of gray, too, of cases still working their way through the process, slowly. And the damage is getting done in the meantime. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, has been making it worse. I said that courts overall are doing a great job, and I meant it. I'd love to include the Supreme Court in that mix, and I can't. The Supreme Court's shadow docket has been particularly outrageously busy. These are cases where the court just puts lower rulings on hold without full briefing or argument. They're cases where the court essentially just says, stop, without explaining why. They've included a few really important high-profile cases, just put on hold by the Supreme Court. Delaying justice, which is denying justice. And most of those Supreme Court orders putting cases on hold have come without explanation. The court just says stop. It doesn't say why. These are full Supreme Court opinions. I have not edited them at all. There's no reasoning there. Those are just stop signs. That's it. Thumbs up or thumbs down, like Caesar delivering judgment on a gladiator. We don't pay the justices of the Supreme Court to rule. We pay them to explain. That's what law is. Law is the process of applying non-arbitrary principles beyond the particular case in question so that we know what the rules are. This isn't law. This is just power. And people are starting to notice. People are starting to notice, and they are not happy about it. A few million people were out in the streets about 2 months ago. You heard Sue request your attendance out in the streets in another couple weeks. Few million people is a lot. And a couple of months ago, that was among the biggest single-day mobilizations ever in the United States. And those are just the ones making themselves heard. There are more. There will be more. And sometimes, people in the streets help set democracy back on course. This isn't magic either. But it can spur a movement, not a partisan movement, something much, much deeper than that, from less perfect to more perfect. And I think this is really important. I mentioned that the administration has been acting in ways that are unlawful. Executive orders that are unlawful, threats from government agencies that are unlawful, immigration enforcement that's unlawful. I haven't talked about the unlawful grift or the unlawful use of government resources to foster personal allegiance. This is a story from last week. But the legal process is slow, very slow. It's deliberate, and it cannot and does not function alone. I keep showing you this picture. See that building with the tower just left of center? That's the old post office in DC. That building is still there. And about 500 feet away is the main Justice Department building. If you walk toward it from this angle, you come to the same corner I showed you before. But this time, don't focus on the banner. Look above it. Right up at the top of the building, there's an inscription from Plato that I used to walk under every day. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and souls of the citizens. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and the souls of the citizens. The law only works if citizens want it to, if we demand that it does. if we say it loud that we value democracy, if we let our representatives in Congress, mostly asleep at the switch at the moment, know that we expect them to do their jobs, this picture looks way too quiet, and maybe because there's nobody home. This is my dog again. He doesn't love it when the institutions don't work. The road back, I think, starts with elections. I'm overjoyed that you had me out today of all days, and I trust I don't have to tell this group in particular how important the elections are. I mentioned that. And I emphatically, by the way, I don't mean that in a partisan sense. I really don't. We deserve representation from across the partisan spectrum who will stand up for the Constitution. But we have to demand it to get it. And that means we got to be loud. Which brings me to the way the elections are going to go. Not just today, not a political prognostication, but the process of the elections coming up this fall. And here, I'm going to disagree just a little bit to make things interesting with some of what you heard just a few weeks ago. There is an enormous amount of disruption going on in the country right now. An enormous amount. But for 99.9% of the country, the process of voting this fall is going to be delightfully, wonderfully boring. Super boring. The process will feel much like it felt when you cast your ballots for today's elections. Very, very usual. Higher stakes, but the process will feel very familiar. For a few reasons, that's not what you'll read about in the news. But I promise you, that's what's going to actually happen. For a couple reasons. First, you will be reading in the news about the president. He's got a talent for grabbing headlines. He does. And he emphatically wants to project power over the election process that he simply doesn't have. He's passed 2 executive orders so far trying to regulate the election process. One in March of 2025, one just 2 months ago. Both are illegal. One has largely been blocked by the courts. The other one's going to be blocked in about a second. And they're illegal for one very simple reason. You don't have to be a lawyer to know they're illegal. Congress has given the president an enormous amount of authority over a lot of aspects of American life. Congress has given the president vanishingly little authority over the elections process. And that assessment is coming from a former presidential policy advisor. There's just not a lot the president gets to do. And more important, when I say the president doesn't really have power over the elections process, I mean it differently here than we're used to. In other arenas, when we say that, most of the time we mean legal authority. With respect to the military, with respect to immigration, with respect to tariffs, he's got control of a switch. And the question is whether he's using that switch in ways that the law allows. We give the president a lot of switches. But when I say the president doesn't really have power over the elections process, yes, I mean there's no legal authority. There's no legal authority. But more importantly, there are vanishingly few switches. Next to no switches that he controls. The people who actually run the elections process are state officials and local officials and poll workers. And when the president demands something, and demands that the process change. When the president demands something he doesn't have the power to demand, the people who actually run things don't have to listen. He's not their boss. He's just some guy yelling about how he'd like stuff to be different, and he's got lots of company in that respect. So they don't have to listen at all. You'll be reading in the news about changes to the election system the president would like. But those aren't changes that are going to happen. Second thing you'll be reading about, disruptions at the polls. Very reliably, every 2 years or so, starting in the summer, there are articles about the armies, and they're always framed in military terms, the armies of volunteers who are going to be deployed to challenge voters. And very reliably, every 2 years, the armies don't materialize. What you hear are the sound of crickets. I've actually been in charge of a national program to recruit tens of thousands of volunteers to show up at the polls, to help voters, to answer questions, to help eligible people cast ballots. They're busy all day long with small flag-waving, small d democracy. And it's really hard to recruit that many people, really legitimately difficult. It is so much harder to recruit people to show up to challenge purportedly illegal voters because illegal voting is vanishingly rare. And that means what people find when they show up for duty is really, again, delightfully boring. Neighbors helping neighbors check in and cast ballots, that's it. Imagine sitting out in a field searching for UFOs, only no UFO ever comes by. It's really hard to recruit armchair detectives to watch paint dry for 15 hours. And so you read about the armies of challengers in the news because a press release is splashy, but they reliably don't show up. This year, I fully expect panic about military or about immigration enforcement to join the armies of challengers at the polls. And look, it is understandable that people are worried about the misuse of the military and misuse of immigration enforcement. I do expect ICE to be out in the streets in a neighborhood or two, mostly for the social media content. But here's the thing. We live in a very, very, very big country. More than 150 million voters in an area spanning 3.8 million square miles, served by nearly 100,000 polling places and nearly 700,000 poll workers. Most of those voters can choose from among multiple ways to cast their ballots, including voting a ballot in person on election day, voting before election day, submitting a ballot via a secure local drop box, voting by mail. It's really hard to disrupt all of that with a few people in a few neighborhoods. The process for the vast majority of voters is going to be very familiar. Now, there are problems with the familiar, to be sure, even here, where students at UC Irvine had to wait online for 4 hours to vote in November 2024, sometimes skipping midterms. And look, to a professor, skipping midterms, no, I'm kidding, of course. The problem isn't skipping midterms. The problem is you can't see the end of that line. That's a problem. I don't want to suggest that we're doing as well as we could be with the election process. There are always ways to improve. Some of that starts with actually paying for the elections we deserve and demand. But sadly, that's not what you'll read about. Those are the real problems. Those are the problems we could address and we should address. You'll read about the disruptions that won't materialize, not the normal ones we've internalized that we shouldn't. The third thing you'll be reading about in the news are the redistricting wars. I mentioned them before. Sue, thankfully, mentioned them before. It's true, I thought my website was over and done in 2022. I was going to set it up, I was going to leave it was going to be nice, I wasn't going to have to return to it every week. Every 10 years after the census, when the census tells us how many people live where, we redraw district lines. We did that in 2021. We shouldn't be doing that now. But we are. The hats may have gotten less fancy, but the sentiment is basically still the same. Incumbents dividing up the world, and it's a blood feud. The Department of Justice started things off last summer with a letter to Texas that I'm pretty sure was a violation of federal law. Texas redrew its congressional maps mid-decade for extreme partisan advantage. That's unconstitutional, still. It's also very familiar. 20 years ago, Texas re-gerrymandered in the middle of the decade. Minority legislators fled the state twice to try and stop it. This is the actual motel in Ardmore, Oklahoma, where they stayed. The House Majority Leader got sanctioned for misusing the FAA to try and find them in a plane. Willie Nelson sent a case of bourbon. It was a thing. A student paper describing the thing began with still the best quote I have ever heard from a student paper. Historically, there are many reasons why middle-aged men might sneak into a motel late at night. Until now, redistricting has not been one of them. It was a giant mess. Fast forward 20 years, Texas back at it again. It is still a giant mess. California, as you know, responded. Missouri and North Carolina responded to the response. Virginia tried. Maryland might still. And the Supreme Court has added substantially to the mess. I know you heard just a few weeks ago about the Louisiana versus Calais case, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and the Southern sprint to redraw district lines in the aftermath. I had several briefs up at the court. They chose not to listen to me. I'm happy to take questions afterward about any of this, but also about the decision and its consequences. I'm not a fan of what the court did. It might surprise you. But the upshot is that there's now a wave of redistricting across the South, most of it in bad faith. Louisiana did, unfortunately, need to redraw lines after the court made its decision. But Florida didn't. Tennessee didn't. Alabama didn't. But did anyway, claiming that they had to. Some of that has already been shot down. More of it may be coming. But the upshot is there are a lot of new congressional lines this year than a more stable democracy should have. Legislators are responsive to public opinion because you get to vote on whether your legislator is doing a good job or not. Partisan gerrymandering in the middle of the decade breaks that feedback loop. It means they're not asking you anymore whether they're doing right by you. And that is a democracy problem. Voters hate this, reliably hate this. Voters of both parties reliably hate this. California Democrats, joined by Republicans, plenty of them, voted to take the district drawing power away from California Democrats. That is, California Democrats said, we don't want Democratic incumbents drawing the lines to favor themselves and not listening to us. Utah Republicans, joined by plenty of Democrats, voted to take the district drawing power away from Republican incumbents. Voters hate this. You can find more examples all over the country. When voters have a say, they want fair districts, not partisan ones, even when the partisan ones benefit their own party. Now, I know California just voted last fall to undo temporarily those fair lines. That's true. But I don't think that was a true voter preference. I think that was voters holding their nose and responding to Texas creating a mess. My evidence? Even as California voted to temporarily undo the congressional lines drawn by a fair, multi-partisan commission, it didn't touch the lines for the state legislature at all. There is nothing that Democratic Party leaders in Sacramento would have liked more than to give the keys back to Democratic incumbents to redraw state legislative lines. They would love that. And they didn't even ask because they knew full well that voters wouldn't stand for it. When voters vote for this thing, even when they vote for this sort of thing, they hate it. And that's meaningful. Partisan gerrymandering acts a little bit like a seawall. It's designed to slow down the normal tides of a partisan opposition, the back and forth between one party and another. A tsunami of turnout comes in right over the top of that seawall. And if the American people feel like democracy itself is under threat, that should be tsunami territory. So those are all reasons to believe that the coming elections are going to be a good start, to getting back to constitutional governance. Not on their own. It's going to take enormous amounts of work to generate that constitutional tsunami. Democracy is an action verb. I'm also not naive enough to believe that elections alone will do it. There's a lot more work to be done. Long-term work. Let me explain it this way. Thanks to a lot of visionary work in the healthcare field, we're now used to talking about the social determinants of health. We know that it's not just first aid and urgent care, that it's not even just medicine and diet and exercise and genetics. It's also where you live and where you work, in your home environment, and stress levels and connections to family and friends. All of those we know and have known for decades. They have a very real impact on your health. We know this matters a lot. That's true for democracy too. Fighting over the rules of elections, that's first aid and urgent care. And it's necessary. Without the basic stuff, the patient bleeds out. So it's important. Work on redistricting and campaign finance, that's a little bit longer term, like medicine and diet and exercise, and still essential. But there's more there. These social determinants of democracy do more work than we recognize at building a more perfect union. Most of them are less present in the Constitution than they probably should be. I think the framers felt them so viscerally, they took them for granted. We don't have that luxury. Civic connection and isolation, and levels of engagement and volunteerism. The delivery of service that constituents expect, and letting people see democracy working for them. An accurate national statistical portrait of who we are and what we do. More broadly, the information we consume, with real intelligence behind it and not just artificial intelligence. And the sources of that information, including enterprises like institutions of local journalism that help keep us informed, trust in government, and the absolutely essential rule of law. I could talk for hours, I won't. I could talk for hours about each of these things and the essential connections that each and every one of them has to democracy. And the fights over things like election budgets and election administration, redistricting, and contests over outcomes, how they form the soil in which democracy flourishes or withers. And all of this takes work. Takes a lot of work to keep a republic. And I will admit, in closing, a lot of it feels suboptimal right about now. It is suboptimal right about now. Here's the thing. It's always been suboptimal. Our work, our job is to nudge it better. We're supposed to keep making it better because it is definitionally suboptimal. And we got a big job to do. Even in California, we had 69% turnout in 2020, 62% in 2024, 43% in 2022. 19% in a special election for a state assembly seat earlier last year. 19% of the constituents thought it mattered. You want big structural change? You want to make sure that each of the branches of government, federal and state, are doing their jobs and listening to the people? 19th Amendment needed a lot more than 19% of the people to show up. We got work to do. But it has ever been thus. There are a few would-be autocrats out there who are seeking power for its own sake or for the grift that it facilitates. And there are a few more who want to empower them to preserve the trappings of power for the powerful against the will of the people. But I am more convinced than ever that that is not what America is. That's not the America that Langston Hughes called to be America again. I'll come back to the building right down the street from this, the one I showed you before. Justice in the life and conduct of the state is possible only as first it resides in the hearts and souls of the citizens. That's true for democracy too. We have a republic, but it is on us to keep it, on us to give life to the structures we've inherited and to keep on making them better, to make them better for all of us, to put in the work that keeps the infrastructure of democracy up to date and that supports the courts in all of the legal actions you're hearing about. And I know for everyone in this room, the fact that you're here means you are already all in. Thank you all so much for putting in that work. It holds more power than you know. Thank you.
How do we reclaim the flag?
We never lost the flag.
Well, when you fly it now, people think MAGA. How do we reclaim it?
More flag. I mean, I honestly think that we have every right to be as proud of the flag as we are of the people. The flag is a symbol of us. The flag is a symbol of the country. It's how we express who we are as Americans. So explain to people what it is and why you're flying it and what it's for. I refuse to give up the flag. And if you want to see what it means to a population that is angry about the current process, go back and look at some of the photos of the Minneapolis subjugation. When ICE is tear gassing people in the streets, you see an awful lot of veterans, and not just veterans, out in the streets with American flags. And I think that is tremendously meaningful to let the public at large know it's our flag. So it's a great question, and part of my answer is don't ever concede that we've lost it for a second. An awful lot of people fought for that flag and are fighting for that flag still. And I think the more we explain to people what that flag is for, the more it belongs to us, all of us.
I was wondering what I can do to ensure that the 28th Amendment gets written into the Constitution.
There are a lot of people angling to figure out what that 28th Amendment's going to be, and there are a lot of good contenders for what that 28th Amendment. By the way, we might have a 28th Amendment already. The Equal Rights Amendment turns out might have been ratified by more than the requisite number of states to put that in the Constitution. So we may be working on 28, we may be working on 29. I think the start, honest to God, is the slide I keep showing you of the 19th Amendment. It takes people in the streets to generate civic courage, to show other people that they too can be in the streets if they want. It's the same portion with the flag. And so my answer to writing whatever you would like the 28th Amendment to be, if you believe it's the Equal Rights Amendment, great. If there's an amendment beyond that you're angling for, I think my answer to that is check your registration. Once you've got your own registration checked, go find 5 people you know who might or might not be as up to date on their registration as possible. Make sure they check their registration. Make sure each of them finds 5 people to get their registrations intact. This is the way the movement starts. And that is not, I am saying that because that is manageable for each and every person in this room, 100% of the time.
Didn't President Biden tell us that the ERA was the 28th Amendment?
He did. Now, in order for that to be meaningful, the government has to act as if it's true. Lawyers need to be relying on it as if it's true. The archivist needs to publish it as if it's true. And then, and only then, will it be true. Constitutional amendments happen because the people make them happen. Even the 28th Amendment, especially the 28th Amendment. And so the moment that we treat the 28th Amendment as the 28th Amendment, it becomes the 28th Amendment. There is actually a moment of building law that you cannot ask for a person in robe to deliver for you. And so when we elect a government that treats the 28th Amendment as the 28th Amendment, it's not just a speech, then it's reality. That's also how we get the 29th and the 30th. And by the way, we are due for some other constitutional amendments. The last time that we went this long without amending the Constitution was the period before the Civil War. So we are overdue for amending the Constitution, but that also applies to the amendments that we've got, to your point. And it takes the country, the reason that we have a supermajority process to amend the Constitution is it was designed to make sure that we collectively had a commitment to the words on the page. The words on the page don't do anything by themselves. And so my answer is the same movement in the streets that gets you the 19th, gets you the impact of the 28th actually acting as the constitutional amendment that it is, and beyond.